I'd like to welcome you. I'd like to thank you for choosing to come indoors at a time where we might otherwise be frolicking in the nice weather. My name is Alan Dale. I'm the director of the Assassination Archives and Research Center, which is a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., the president of which is our nation's leading Freedom of Information Act attorney, Jim Lazar. I also serve as an administrative and research assistant to Dr. John Newman, and it is in that context that we are here today. I'm going to begin with words spoken by Robert F. Kennedy, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, exactly 2 years to the day before he died. June 6, 1966, he was making an important appearance at Cape Town University in South Africa. It was their day of affirmation. It was a speech which has been analyzed and quoted in innumerable ways over innumerable decades, with reason. But this is an excerpt that you might not have heard before. And I quote, "Dr. Martin Luther King is the second man of African descent to win the Nobel Peace Prize for his nonviolent efforts for social justice between races. We have passed laws prohibiting discrimination in education, in employment, in housing, but these laws alone cannot overcome the heritage of centuries of broken families and stunted children, and poverty and degradation and pain. So the road toward equality of freedom is not easy, and great cost and danger march alongside us. We are committed to peaceful and nonviolent change, and that is important for all to understand, though all change is unsettling. Still, even in the turbulence of protest and struggle, is greater hope for the future, as men learn to claim and achieve for themselves the rights formerly petitioned from others. And most important of all the panoply of government power has been committed to the goal of equality before the law, as we are now committing ourselves to the achievement of equal opportunity. In fact," he continued, "we must recognize the full human equality of all of our people before God, before the law, and in the councils of government. We must do this not because it is economically advantageous, although it is, not because of the laws of God commanded, although they do, not because people in other lands wish it so. We must do it for the single and fundamental reason that it is the right thing to do." Our speaker this evening has a distinguished academic history. It includes, in 1997, he was the speaker at the Congressional Black Caucus Convention, 1998, scholar in residence of the National Alliance of Black School Educators, 1999 Actions of Courage Award winner, cited by the City Council of Detroit and given the honorary keys to the city of Detroit. He has taught America in the 60s for more than a quarter century. For the University of Maryland Honors College, 1994-2014, and during that period for the University of Maryland University College. In 2002, he was the recipient of the Stanley J. Dragic Teaching Excellence Award, the most prestigious award recognizing the highest teaching accomplishments by outstanding UMUC faculty members. His selection for that award was based upon several letters of recommendation submitted by African American students regarding his spellbinding lectures on Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement in America. He has continued to teach and publish about the 20th century African American experience over the past 8 years at James Madison University, and his class on America in the 60s, like his classes on terrorism and counterterrorism, is always full, with a waiting list whenever it is offered. In an address before Princeton University's graduating class of 1954, Adlai E. Stevenson said this: "The right to the serene pursuit of truth did not descend like manna from heaven. It was won by hard fighting and the fight goes on and on to the end of time, even as the struggle between good and evil. He declared to his audience and to all who might eventually read his words that ours is a government conducted by its citizens, and from this it follows that the government will be better conducted if its citizens are educated. More than 50 years since the deaths of JFK, MLK, and RFK, details relating to their assassinations have accumulated like snowflakes in a blizzard. Hundreds of names, thousands of alleged facts, millions upon millions of words competing for our attention and necessitating our judgment. Is this important? Is this true? Faced with so many puzzles and so many details, there can be no greater service to the pursuit of truth in the case of President Kennedy's assassination than to apply an objectively critical methodology to what we think we already know. For progress to be made, we must be willing to periodically reevaluate what we think we understand to be true. Into the Storm, The Assassination of President Kennedy, Volume 3, provides details, insights, and revelations about the absolutely essential question of context. What was the true nature of American civil society and the national security state during the era of President John F. Kennedy, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and Robert F. Kennedy? In an eloquent endorsement of Into the Storm, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. refers to Dr. Newman's book as a groundbreaking work that finally illuminates the dark places where democracy goes to die. He here exposes the momentous official lies that for 50 years have been corroding the heart of American idealism. Dr. John Newman is adjunct professor of political science at James Madison University. He's a retired U.S. Army officer who served for 2 years as military assistant to the Director, General William Odom, at the National Security Agency. He has testified before various subcommittees of the U.S. House of Representatives, worked as a consultant on 2 major motion pictures, Oliver Stone's JFK and Nixon, and to various U.S. and foreign media organizations, including PBS Frontline, the History Channel, C-SPAN, NBC, and other news agencies. His experience and expertise as a strategic intelligence cryptologic analyst make his qualifications and credentials unique among those who delve into the hidden histories buried within America's military and intelligence bureaucracies. For the past quarter century, his works have overturned orthodoxy, broken new ground, introduced new facts, and produced revelations about America during the era of the Cold War. His work is history in the making. Please welcome Dr. John Newman.
Good evening, and thank you for coming.
Speak up.
I'm going to try and read a lot tonight, because you guys in my classes know what happens when I start talking. I get in trouble very quickly, and I look up at the clock, and it's time for the class to be over. So I will not be able to resist some extemporaneous comments here and there, but I'll try and stay pretty much to my schedule tonight. So let me begin. A moment of profound shock led to my initial interest in African American history. I was 16 years old. My father, who worked for Chrysler Corporation, was reassigned from London to Detroit in January 1967. We had first moved to Geneva, Switzerland when I was 7 years old in 1957. From that time until my return to America, I grew up with children all around the world. As a child, I was often asked 3 questions. Are your parents Hollywood stars? Do they have a gun? And why do white Americans hate black Americans? I always insisted that there was no racial discrimination in America. After 10 years away from America, my return to Detroit, just in time for the riots there in July 1967, 67, shattered my concept of America. From our comfortable white suburb on the outskirts of the city, I watched Detroit burn for days. I was shell-shocked. Things didn't go much better when I arrived at George Washington University 1 year later. Having grown up in Europe, I was a walk-on for a soccer scholarship, and besides the goalkeeper, the only white player on the team. We were in the Southern Conference that year. All of our players were from Africa, all of them, except for me. We were in the Southern Conference that first year, which we won handily, and then we quit it. The principal reason we left the Southern Conference was because of our bus trips through the South for games against Virginia Military Institute and the Citadel. When our bus stopped at restaurants, we were usually told to leave. The tension was visceral. The local restaurants had no idea they were dealing with real Africans, African athletes too, that were big and strong and hungry, and not accustomed to such blatant Jim Crow racism. The coach was very concerned and managed to get us out of the situations until we would just take sandwiches with us on the buses. I lived off campus in a house with African American bass players who also attended George Washington, and by this time I was under no illusion about racism in America. Later on, as a professor, and as a result of my first book, JFK in Vietnam, I was invited to teach a course on America in the 60s at the Honors College at University of Maryland. I've been doing so for the next 27 years, including the last 6 years here at James Madison. I fully understand the importance of the good work of the major national civil rights groups like the NAACP and others. However, I've always been fascinated by the grassroots African American groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and other student-based organizations like the Congress of Racial Equality. My students this semester will recall the unsung heroes of my 60s class this semester, of the 1956 Montgomery bus boycott, which happened to be Martin Luther King's coming out on his first call to duty as a major spokesperson for civil rights. And by the way, those unsung heroes were 4 black women who did janitorial work in City Hall. It was their idea to have the whole street mass meeting and the bus boycott. That's a topic for another time. What I mean to say is that I've always thought of young people and working black women as the true heartbeat of the American civil rights movement. Through a good friend and yoga practitioner of mine, Jackie Wells, who's sitting right here this evening with us, thank you, Jackie, I was introduced to a local grassroots organization, the Shenandoah Valley Black Heritage Project. And they're here tonight. Thank you very much for coming. The director, Robin Lytle's here, and some of her staff. I'm going to leave this over here. There are things about it. Oh, you have some? Okay, here we have a whole pile of them. Good. Some brochures about the center and what they do. So I want to recognize and congratulate Jackie and her staff for actually stepping out and doing this here in our community. And instead of me telling you any more about it, I'd like to invite Jackie Lytle up here to tell us more about the project and maybe even something about the play, you guys.
Okay. Sure. Thank you. Good evening, and I'm going to have to stand around like this.
There's no microphone. They say the room's too small.
No, but I'm too short for the computer.
Skip forward.
I know.
Good.
I have a good voice. Theater background, folks. Thank you all. Thank you so much for inviting us here tonight. It's an honor to be here and to be able to talk to this audience. My name is Robin Lytle, and I'm one of the founders of the Shenandoah Valley Black Heritage Project. And we started in 2013 to learn and recover the African American history here in the Shenandoah Valley. When I came out here, my career and base is also Washington, D.C., so in talking to John, I've been able to follow some of his history in the city as well, and I'm also from the University of Maryland. We started this project after I came out here because I discovered that there was a rich history here in the valley that had not been discussed. You couldn't go to a historical society and find anything out about African American history here in the valley. So that prompted us our initial start for the project. We work to recover this history, And part of what we've discovered is a history of Valley men who fought for the United States colored troops in the U.S. Navy during the Civil War. We've identified over 600 men from the Valley that fought in that war that are documented. This history includes generations of freeborn families and people, descendants from white women and manumissioned enslaved people prior to the end of the Civil War. There's a huge history here that starts as mid-1700s and even earlier now that we've been doing some genealogy and some DNA. We know that our African American friends are descendants of some of the earliest pioneers here in the Valley. We've done research on the antebellum property owners here in Harrisonburg. There were many, you were allowed to buy property. Okay, you may not have been able to do anything else prior to the end of the Civil War, but you could buy property. And here in Harrisonburg, we had dozens of families, African American families, who prior to the Civil War bought and built homes here in the city. And one of those is still standing on 42 in Wolf Street. The Rosenwald schools dot our landscape. This was a joint effort of Julius Rosenwald and the Booker T. Washington, and that resulted in over 5,000 schools that were built in the Valley, in the South, and several are within an hour's reach of here. Our students are studying, and our intern students, our middle and high school, they're studying the early schools because school started right after the Civil War and as soon as it was allowed. So they're doing that research for us in the Valley. Our adults are working on the cemeteries and creating a database about the cemeteries. We help families learn about their history. We create family trees, and we also give out DNA kits, and all of our services are free. Our program has included topics. We do topics about the music, art of the Valley, the Reconstruction era, and the communities of the Valley, just to name a few. We have an annual homecoming out at Zendo at the Long's Chapel, which has been restored, and Reverend Brown comes out and preaches at that service every year, and he is a descendant of several of the families that started that community right after the Civil War. So it's been great being able to reunite the families with their early home places, even though they're long since have been taken or gone away from those communities. We also write and produce original readings, and our most recent was a show called Not Made for This, and this piece was based on a narrative of Jordan Banks. There's two enslaved narratives of the enslaved in the Shenandoah Valley. One is Jordan Banks. He was enslaved on the Yancey farms near Elkton, Port Republic area. Brianna Madden Oliveris, a high school student, one of our interns, was commissioned to finish the piece. We started it in 2018. She worked with us in the original production, spent a year, and then we just produced it a few weeks ago here in the city. She added her, she's a spoken word artist and a really good one, and she created a character called Amina, who was a high school student, in a predominantly white high school. And what she did was she took and created spoken word monologues that wove through the words of Jordan, 1862, and showed us just how much we're still dealing with the same questions. I mean, obviously the severity is much different, but she was calling to the attention of what she had to do and how she had to be in that predominantly white high school, as opposed to the way she would really like to be, which would be more of her own self. So that was a really wonderful production, and we're going to be watching her. She's going to be going to the new school in New York next year. Briefly, and I want to talk briefly about the R4 project, because civil rights is a big part of my history, because I was born in 1950. So I remember the speeches that we all talk about, Dr. King's, Bobby Kennedy's, and so many others from that time. But what was going on here was really, really very sad, and something that we need to address and continue to address. And that's the R4 project. That was the urban renewal programs that came up in the 1960s. I feel they were a direct reaction to the civil rights movement. It was another way of quite honestly, oppressing communities. In the 1960s here in Harrisonburg, 60 homes and all the black businesses were destroyed. Under the quote-unquote urban renewal, it was to get rid of blighted communities. Well, we all know that these communities may have had a few houses that were subnormal, may have had some health issues, but by and large, there were new properties. Many of the homes that were destroyed were barely 10 years old and were stately Victorians. And now, in its place, are still empty parking lots and undeveloped area in the Northeast neighborhood area. And it's just something that we've talked about. We spent a lot of time talking about it today. I spent time with John talking about it. And it's something that we would like to see. We would like to see a map and a model created to show what that neighborhood looked like prior to the destruction of the neighborhood. And that's one of the projects that we're also working on. It was a reaction to the civil rights movement, and again, like I said, more to suppress what was going on. I mean, I look today at a mostly vacant parking structure where the caterer from the community used to live and cook in her home prior to that being taken away, and now it's just still, a few parking spaces. We like to see a map, as I said, a model of this to show where everything happened and to give back that identity and that history. And that's what's working together on programs tonight and talking about the civil rights movement, how it affected us in the past and how it is still affecting us today. And time after time, we see parts of our cities, the areas that were traditionally the black neighborhoods, being the neighborhoods that are targeted for lower income housing projects, for renewal projects, quote unquote, that don't necessarily renew the moral value or the families that are in those communities, and they certainly don't give back to them. So thank you for the opportunity. It's a blessing. My friends Sharon, Barbara, and Corliss are here from the center with Jackie. We get together there. We opened our center a few months ago. We solve the world's problems and talk about chicken and our favorite whatevers. And so John knows how to find us, and so will you after tonight. Thank you. God bless.
So I have something I want to give as an exhibit to the Heritage project that I've sat on for a long time. I will be getting around to writing on it at some point, but it's a discovery I made in the National Archives, Central Intelligence Agency documents. When you go down to the Hoover building, the FBI building, and go to the reading room and ask to see MLK documents, they say sure, and they bring you a stack of things. You can see the date and everything's black. The House Select Committee on Assassinations investigated not just John Kennedy and also MLK. And after the passage of the JFK Records Act in 1992, every document in every investigation of the Kennedy assassination was legally a JFK record and had to be released. And that's where I found this amazingly disturbing stuff. It's a disturbing story, but it is history, and it's very important, and I'll get around to writing. So I've never shared this with anybody ever, publicly.
Well,
and what we have here, and you can look at it afterwards, I've laminated it, and this is an exhibit just for you to take.
Oh, wonderful.
Today.
Thank you so much.
And this one too.
Oh, wow.
These are documents written at a high level in the CIA, the security office, and they're about an informant, a CIA mole inside of Martin Luther King's inner circle. The narrative going on in here is very, very disturbing, and it is about the expectation that Martin Luther King will one day be assassinated, and that it would be a terrible thing if he would be assassinated before he was discredited. And even more important, that he be discredited by a black person or black people than white people. And that's the narrative going on in here. And I've also taken the liberty to blow them up for you and put them in this packet.
Wow, thank you so much.
And thank you for all your work.
Appreciate it. We're going to have a pop-up museum this Friday, so I have a hunch I know this will be on display. So thank you so much.
Welcome. You're welcome.
Really
thank you for what you do. I'm fortunate that our department chair, Dr. John Keller, and his predecessor, Dr. Charles Blake, have allowed me to mentor nearly 30 political science interns over the past several years at James Madison. I hope to encourage some of our future interns to work with the Black Heritage Project. My interns get involved in all sorts of very interesting things. And this evening I want to recognize one in particular, Celine Gomez, who after interning twice for me for credit, has continued to do so without credit. Celine's an extraordinary scholar, and she's going to do really well. And Celine, if you would just come up here so they can see you. This is a letter of recommendation for you to just put in your pocket and use whenever it. She's still doing work now up to the last second before she leaves, but I would like you to share a little something that you did on this most recent project, if you would please.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Celine Gomes, and I'm a senior international affairs student. I've been interning for Dr. Newman over a year now and have completed a number of interesting assignments. I remember when Dr. Newman first spoke to me about my Department of Justice Gary Rowe Thomas Jr. assignment. For those who may be unfamiliar with him, Rowe was in the Ku Klux Klan in Birmingham, Alabama, and was an informant for the FBI from 1960 to 1965. Dr. Newman told me that I was one of the first people to see this information, including the President of the United States. I was in awe of the privilege set before me. The document I had as my assignment, as with most of the assignments I've been given, taught me so much more than anything I've been able to learn in the classroom. As opposed to reading something in a textbook, which is always written with bias and has been filtered, the assignments I have worked on during this internship are released government documents, meaning that the information is unaltered in content with the exception of a few redactions here and there, and that I am able to learn straight from the source and form my own opinions. In this specific assignment, I learned that the FBI policy at the time Rowe was an informant was that FBI agents only orally told informants that engagement in acts of violence was prohibited, that the FBI would not condone it. One of Rowe's handlers specifically told him that he would be disowned by the FBI and treated as an ordinary criminal if he engaged in violence, whereas other handlers of his seemed to permit occasional participation in violent acts. I found that the FBI records and testimonies of Rowe also conflicted in that at least 2 reports severely misconstrued the amount of violence Rowe participated in during his time as an informant in the KKK. Let there be no mistake, Rowe was not a good man, and there were instances in which the FBI did not fully report on his involvement as a Klan member. For the sake of time, I will speak only to one of the events my assignment covered, the Trailways bus station incident of 1961, in which the Freedom Riders were attacked by the KKK. Rowe informed the FBI of the Klan's plans ahead of time, but instead of formulating a decisive plan of action with local authorities to prevent the attack from being carried out, both the FBI and local authorities refused to act. The result was that harm befell valiant men and women who were peacefully fighting for equality and justice. The federal and local authorities' knowledge of the plans ahead of time and their refusal to come to the aid of citizens then categorized this not only as a hate crime, but also an act of state-sponsored terrorism. This is the kind of work Dr. Newman gives his interns, a first-hand look at the victories and failings of our government so that we may rise to leadership positions with unique knowledge and the extra drive, perseverance, and responsibility to do better for our country. At the close of this assignment, I had one quote running through my head. If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. Thank you.
Okay. Escape. And here. All right, you'll have to excuse my voice, it's a little raspy. I've had quite a bit of oral surgery recently. I'm lucky to be talking to you tonight, but I feel fine to do that. It was harder on Monday when I had to lecture for 2.5 hours in the counterterrorism class. So this will be fine tonight, just a little bit raspy. Let's see, what I want to do is that. My main focus this evening is the extraordinary role that race played in the 1960 presidential election. But before I turn to that topic, I want to briefly lay out, for a couple of minutes, the overall context of the thorny issue of civil rights during President Kennedy's 3-year administration and Bobby Kennedy's evolution afterwards. After JFK's election, African Americans organized nonviolent protests and implored President Kennedy to call for comprehensive civil rights legislation. But for the first 2 years of his administration, Kennedy ignored that call. The Democrats held a thin majority in Congress, and many Democratic seats were held by Southerners opposed to civil rights legislation. JFK needed their votes to get his foreign policy and domestic and economic bills passed. Part of Kennedy's otherwise very ambitious New Frontier program, many of these bills for the first time extended significant help to the poor, the middle class, and small businesses and that kind of thing. So JFK decided to adopt a cautious approach to overt civil rights legislation, which means in effect no civil rights legislation. In May 1961, white racists attacked the Freedom Riders traveling by bus from Washington, D.C. to Birmingham, Alabama. The armed marshals sent by Attorney General Robert Kennedy could not adequately protect the protesters from the mayhem that occurred because of the Freedom Ride. RFK's initial reaction was that this turmoil made the United States and his brother, the president, look bad in the eyes of the world. Furthermore, RFK felt that the protests weakened the president's ability to deal with Khrushchev during the escalating nuclear-tinged Berlin crisis of 1961. This is Checkpoint Charlie and the standoff of the Soviet and American tanks. We were on the edge of nuclear war, not just in 1962 in the Cuban Missile Crisis, but right here in this moment as well. Bobby Kennedy and a military intelligence official from the Soviet Union are responsible for having behind the scenes arranged a deal between Kennedy and Khrushchev. Frustrated by John Kennedy's fear of the segregationists, on 3 March 1962, Dr. King criticized Kennedy in an article he entitled "Fumbling on the New Frontier." He said the defensive posture of the president against adversaries seasoned in the art of combat and older than the nation itself will increase his impotence, not release his strength. They've already paralyzed his executive power by holding hostage his legislative program. If he cannot break out of this prison, he may become a tragically helpless figure. In September 1962, James Meredith, a black man, attempted to register at the segregated University of Mississippi at Oxford. Kennedy had brokered a deal with segregationist Governor Ross Barnett. But Kennedy prematurely announced Meredith's successful registration on national television. Barnett had broken his promise not to incite violence, and the U.S. Marshals ended up fighting a losing battle to control the violence at the university. In fact, Governor Barnett incited the riot from the 50-yard line on the football field of the homecoming game that fall. During the spring 1963 violence in Birmingham, Alabama, King was imprisoned in solitary confinement. He wrote the now famous Letter from Birmingham Jail in response to a public statement of caution issued by 8 white religious leaders. King wrote that history proved privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily, and that just as theologian Reinhold Niebuhr has reminded us, groups are more immoral than individuals. We'll have a little more to say about Reinhold Niebuhr in the main part of my presentation and his influence on King. So the nightsticks, no, I should go back. Hello. Okay, I want to go here. This Birmingham jail letter also has this famous line here that is quoted over and over again by people who are familiar with Martin Luther King, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. He said, I can't sit over here and not go over there and help out what my brothers are doing in Birmingham. And he's often asked the question, why didn't you give the president more time to act? And his response, the only answer is that the new administration must be prodded about as much as the outgoing Eisenhower one was before it acts today. So the nightsticks, the police dogs, and the fire hoses during the 3 May 1963 violence in Birmingham left President Kennedy no choice but to alter his course. His new frontier at home was deteriorating into a gory race war